welcome. I'm very excited to introduce Brooke Foucault, today's visitor for the CITP Luncheon Speaker Series. She is Associate Professor of Communication at Northeastern University. She's also the Associate Dean for Research at the College of Arts, Media, and Design at Northeastern, and the Director of Network Science. I have actually known Brooke since he started graduate education at Northwestern University. So we go way back, and already then she was doing very exciting network science research. So I think it's fair to say that she was doing this before it became as popular as it is. So really an early adopter of that method, really innovative, very careful, thorough work on large scale network data sets that she's written about quite a bit. She has an award-winning book with Sarah Jackson and Moya Bailey called #Activism that looks at networks of race and gender justice. It's a really wonderful, very accessible book that I got a lot out of reading, and I highly recommend to others. And we're honored and excited to have Brooke visit us, so welcome.
Yeah. That was a delightful introduction. I appreciate it. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I want to thank you all for coming out. Anybody who happens to be on the webinar, if that's a thing, welcome. I can't see you, but I trust that you're there. And also, look, full disclosure, this is a bit of an intimidating place for me to speak. So a lot of the minds who have sort of shaped my own work, including Esther, but lots of others whose names are on doors around the hallway around here, they've really been very influential on me. And so I hope I can do justice to the work that you all are kind of steeped in and privileged enough to be trained in and to be around all the time. So without further ado, I wanted to kind of situate myself. I'm at a weird moment in my career. So I've recently shifted into taking on a lot of administrative roles. So you can see my lab logo and the Network Science Institute logo, the College of Arts, Media, and Design. So I spend a lot of my time trying to enable research and not quite as much time actually executing on the research myself anymore, although I strongly come out of that tradition. So these are the two books, one author co-authored and one co-edited, that really tried to carve out this intellectual space around network communication, where we think about the tools of network science combined with the data that are available about human communication, the traces that are left behind, and we try to do interesting things like discover how people are doing activism. And so that boundary is permeable. I mean, I'm not a designer, but I tried to represent that as a permeable boundary. But I've really been thinking a lot about how is it that academia can do this kind of impact-oriented research, right? So that's where my research life and my administrative life meet. And I really like to encourage us to think in that space today. So how can the tools and theories of our various disciplinary backgrounds really, start to tackle the thorny problems that we're all dealing with? And there's plenty of them. I'm sure you're all working on them. And there's not enough time in the day or a lifetime to really solve some of these problems, but that's kind of where I'm coming from. And the thorny problem that I deal with is social change, broadly speaking, and particularly social change by and about folks who are marginalized. I study the internet, as you probably realized before you came to the talk today. And there's countless examples of these kinds of movements that were either born online or catalyzed online in a significant way. So we have the Umbrella Revolution, January 25th, which was arguably the kind of first instance where we all saw this happening, Black Lives Matter and Me Too. And of course, I could not possibly put all of these things, but I think that it's safe to say that it's unlikely to find a country or a set of people that have been completely untouched by these movements and their accompanying hashtags. So the hashtags become the focus of data collection, really, for me, and become this interesting organizing premise in my work. And the way I think about this, Esther alluded to my collaborative work. So I tend to collaborate with critical race and critical gender scholars, folks who really dig into the content of these communications. But what I do tends to be a little bit more computational and driven by the structure of these conversations. So I'm going to unpack some different examples of how I tackle that today. At its most basic, we could take a tweet like this one, which is a real tweet used with permission. And we can see a couple of features. So if I were searching as a data scientist, I could search on the hashtag Black Lives Matter. Okay, so that's straightforward. It would turn up a tweet like this. Then we have some features. So the feature I'm going to draw your attention to is the person who authored the content. So that's Awesomely Lucky, and DeLucia, who is a person who retweeted that content. Now, I focus a lot on Twitter, but we can imagine there are affordances like this on every platform. So on Facebook, we might share, on TikTok, we might stitch, and so on. So every platform has something like this. Right. So to create a network, we can take this relationship and we can draw a line. The way I tend to draw lines is back to the source content, so we can see who's creating material that gets widely shared. You can draw those lines. It's just an abstraction, right? So you can draw it in the other direction if you want, or you draw it both ways. If you're really into the network science, we can nerd out on that in the Q&A. So this is how I draw lines. And then abstracted, we can do that for any user who's retweeted any other user in a particular network. And then when we do that, we kind of aggregate up into something that looks like this. And this one is even really quite small. Most of the networks that I work with are, on the scale of several 100,000 to several million users. So those are the patterns we're working with. And the reason that I like this approach, there's a few reasons. So I like it because it allows us to retain the individual actions. So I don't want to discount the individual act of liking or retweeting or stitching or whatever it is you're doing on your social media. Those things matter. So those are the things that become the material that amplifies other people online or that elevates certain ideas. So the network science allows us to retain that, but it also allows us to look at the structural patterns. So there's no reason not to just take a random sample of tweets or TikToks or what have you. But when we take a random sample, we can't see things like who's getting upvoted to be the most important message, or which messages are most likely to be seen if I were to randomly approach a hashtag like Black Lives Matter. And so the network allows us to kind of have that high level structure while still retaining the ability to look at the individuals. So that's how I approach all this work. All right, so I'm going to share my first case study with you. And this is a case study in amplification. So in networks, we can look at amplification by looking at who's sort of pointing at someone else in the network. And as it turns out, this is not random, right? So you don't just randomly retweet people. You do that in some purposeful way. And you choose presumably content that resonates with you or content that you think needs to be elevated. And that creates these particular network structures that are pretty interesting. To give you context, this particular example is the hashtag MyNYPD, which we're not too far from New York. So those of you who have lived here for a little while may recall this particular hashtag. It wasn't a huge one though. So I wouldn't be surprised if many of you don't know this particular case study. So this one happened on the heels of this particular court decision in August 2013, the state Supreme Court in the state of New York rendered a decision in Floyd versus the city of New York that effectively said that the stop and frisk policy that the New York police were using was unconstitutional on the grounds that it was unfairly targeting people of color. So it wasn't being equally applied. This is a policy where police officers could stop and interrogate people on the basis of suspicion of having committed a crime without any evidence that they had committed a crime. And as we might well imagine, that wasn't going evenly. And certainly there was strong evidence, including the testimony of several police officers, that this policy was applied disproportionately. And so the state Supreme Court said, you can't do that anymore. Right? So that's kind of in the ether. About a year after that, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. And I highlight this because I think this is arguably the point in time in the United States where discussions about police violence against citizens of color went from a conversation that was largely had in communities of color to a conversation that was on the front page of the New York Times. So this is where the sort of mainstream perception of how police interact with communities, I don't know that it radically changed at that point, but certainly opened up to include more perspectives. close at that point. So right in the middle of this mix is where we get my NYPD. So in April of 2014, the New York Police Department, apparently not being very familiar with Twitter, posted this. So they said, do you have a photo with a member of the NYPD? Tweet us and tag it, #myNYPD. It may be featured on our Facebook. Okay, so we're dating ourselves a little, but this is what happened. And they gave you a helpful example here of 2 police officers. Looks like they might be in Times Square, kind of with someone smiling, wearing, I believe, an NYPD hat. Great. Okay. So this, as you might imagine, did not go as planned. So they did get a handful of photographs of police at Yankees games, and police horses were fairly popular. People like a horse. And then, hundreds of thousands of tweets over the course of 2 days that the vast majority of which portrayed police violence. So this is surely not what they were hoping to get, and yet this is what turned up. So here's a few examples of these kinds of tweets. A lot of them had this nature. If you read the paper, sarcasm was one way that the popular tweets got popular by kind of juxtaposing. Clearly. This is not what they were looking for. There are these kinds of like snarky tweets, right? So they will help you detangle your hair. Clearly they're not hairstylists. This is an act of violence, and so on. And so we have police at protests. This is not what they were looking for, and yet these were the stories that were there to be told. Because I'm a network scientist, I turned to my co-author on the paper and said, we should look at the networks in here. And, I put these up. This is just a sample of papers that were popular at the time. There was a lot of work on the structure of Twitter, right? So how do things trend on Twitter? What's the overall structure of Twitter? And I don't expect you to read the abstracts here. Suffice it to say, the prevailing wisdom at the time was that, contrary to popular belief, Twitter was not, in fact, a kind of grassroots communication tool. It was effectively a broadcast mechanism. And so people who were popular in the offline world or in the regular sort of traditional media world, so like popular politicians, celebrities, the people who run newsrooms, so folks who already have a platform, were the ones who also trended on Twitter. And I think that is still probably the case, maybe even more so in the last year. But what we found was something a little different. I fully expected when I looked at this network to see the most popular users be the New York Times, maybe Rudy Giuliani, right? So like political figures or major mainstream news outlets. And that is not, in fact, who is at the center of this network. So these things are hard to read. What you're seeing here is a kind of cleaned up version of those 100,000 plus tweets. Focusing in on the folks who were more connected in this network, and really focusing in on those nodes in the network or individual accounts that were the most popular. And the way you get popular in a retweet network like this one is either you have one tweet that kind of is runaway popular, right? So it gets a zillion retweets, or you have several tweets that get a medium amount of engagement. There are other ways, but those are the normal ways. And so these were often in the second category. So there were a few tweets that got some amount of attention, and so they end up being really popular. I picked 12 because if you look at the distribution of attention that people were getting, there's a real drop off after 12, and that's not uncommon. We see that a lot in social networks. There's like extreme disproportionate attention to a small number of nodes in the network, and then everyone else sort of has a same amount of interactions. I think if you've been on any social media platform, this probably resonates, that like, once every 3 years, something goes viral and then the rest of your tweets get 6 likes from your friends. So that's what we see here. And these 12, there are a few things to notice. And so we see some activist organizations, not super surprising, although to give you a sense of scale, at the time, Occupy Wall Street, which is the biggest one, here had just over 100,000 followers, and Katy Perry had something like 10 million. So it's like big, but not that big. And we see Cop Watch, which is, police violence or anti-police violence activist organization. some kind of alt news or like questionable news quality. So I'd put some into the alt, like Vice. It's not a mainstream news outlet, but is a news outlet, and then some into the questionable, like AJ Stream is a kind of a news aggregator. And then like several people who are just regular people, like Lauren again, is actually Jeannie Lawrence, who ended up writing the foreword for our book, but she was just like a local activist in New York at the time. Kamani Film and the Real Kiori, these are folks who've had personal interactions with the police that were violent and shared photos of that. So I think Kamani Film had about 35 followers before this thing. So like regular people are gaining an audience here. This is not what we expected. Thanks to Commissioner Bill Breton, it gave us a little clue about what the real story was here. So he said in a press conference about the MyNYPD hashtag incident, he said, most of the pictures I looked at, they're old news. They've been out there for a long time, among other things. And I think he was saying this as a way to dismiss that, like, this is not a big deal. We've known these photos. Actually, this is a huge deal. When you think about the process of activism and social change, of course, that's true, right? So all of these people had these photos. It's not as if the New York City Police Department asked for photos and then everyone went out and had a violent altercation with the police. That's not what happened. What had happened is that they had those altercations and they had photographs of them. And in many cases, they had tried to share those photographs before and no one paid attention. So we did not hear about the Real Kiori's violent interaction with police until MyNYPD helped it trend. And it did trend, right? So we didn't get a ton of mainstream news coverage. A lot of it was regional, but we did see pieces in the Washington Post and CNN, New York Magazine. So lots of people did stories about not exactly the police violence. They did stories about the kind of PR snafu of this MyNYPD hashtag. And at the same time, they included the images. So suddenly a picture that no one could get any attention for is appearing in the Washington Post, right? And so this is a very different picture than the ones that we usually see of police officers in the United States, or at least that we did in 2014. We also saw some television news coverage. So I'm going to go ahead and read you the quote because this, thanks to Ari Melber, who effectively wrote the conclusion to our paper. So he says he's sitting in for Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC, which is a democratically leaning left-leaning news program. And he said, quote, anyone who follows politics today knows about the simplistic and often false choice of whether we should be agitating on the internet or on the streets. But here's the thing about most of the photos. They were all taken in the streets. They all happened in the streets. And yet many of them didn't achieve initially any great impact, let alone response from the city or press, until they found traction through the online publishing platforms. Unquote. And so this is where we birthed a new theory about social change on the internet. I assume many of you in the room are already familiar with public sphere theory. So this is really the theory that grounds all of our online activism work. And this theory, loosely says that in an ideal democracy, the way things should work is that the public should gather in places and they should kind of debate the terms of the day, come to some kind of conclusion, and then ideally pass that on to elected officials who enact that in law and policy, right? So that sounds familiar. Good. Very quickly on the heels of this paper being published, several scholars, notably Black and queer scholars, came out and said, look, that's a cute theory, but we all know that not everyone gets invited into those public spaces. There are certain barriers that are systematically excluding people of color, people with disabilities, trans and queer folks, to some extent women, and folks are not allowed into those spaces. It does not mean, though, that folks are utterly disenfranchised. Right? Sometimes they literally are, but what happens is that folks gather in alternate spaces called counterpublics. And counterpublics do the work of kind of acknowledging each other, first of all, to say your experience is real, and then advocating and agitating to be recognized in the mainstream. Okay, so we have publics and counterpublics. Fast forward a couple decades, and Benkler and others noticed that this is not happening, in coffee houses or salons anymore. That a lot of this work is actually happening online, and that the internet can serve as a viable platform in order to have these kinds of conversations. So then we should take seriously the work of online spaces and online communities in the processes of social change. And so if you're following along and a fan of symmetry, I think you can guess where we're going with this. And the intervention that Sarah and I introduced into the literature was network counterpublics, that for a lot of the same reasons that people are excluded from offline spaces, the very same kinds of people tend to be excluded from online spaces as well. And so when we look at the overall structure of a place like Twitter, it's unsurprising that our colleagues in the computational social sciences and network sciences are finding that those very most popular users are celebrities, politicians, the brokers of information on mainstream news like journalists and editors and so on. That's not a surprise at all, because the internet is exactly designed to preference people like that. And yet there are these cases where we can find groups of people who gather around the organizing auspices of these hashtags into these network counterpublics to advance some other narrative than maybe we're hearing from those mainstream publics. And through the power of simultaneously tweeting and retweeting, for example, can inject those alternate narratives into the mainstream, even if only temporarily. So that's the sort of premise of our whole book. And we go through several case studies describing how people do this. So we cover a range of trans rights, Black rights, women's rights issues. We also have a chapter on allyship, which I would love to expand on someday. Sort of arguing this mechanism exists. So one mechanism in my NYPD case is this mechanism of amplification, right? So we can, by the act of retweeting and retweeting and retweeting, create centers of attention on certain kinds of narratives that didn't otherwise get a lot of attention before. The second one I want to share with you is a different network mechanism. So this one is reciprocal self-disclosure. It's a slightly more mathematically complicated mechanism, but I think as a concept, it really makes a lot of sense. Right. So when we think about self-disclosure, when you're telling people stuff and forming relationships, we might start, someone might tell you something about themselves, maybe something that happened to them. And then the kind of normal conversational pattern is for you to also disclose something. So maybe, I say I'm having a bad day because I didn't get a good night's sleep. And you might say, oh, that's too bad. Like, I didn't get a great night's sleep over the weekend and I'm still kind of laggy, right? So that's like a usual way. It would be weird for me to say, I'm having a bad day, I didn't get a good night's sleep, and for you to walk away. That's socially not normative thing to do. Okay, so that's how we form relationships, typically speaking. So again, we might operationalize that as nodes. And in this case, because we expect the disclosure, we don't necessarily need to have both arrows, although mathematically sometimes we keep both, or you could just sort of collapse them into one, right? So this is reciprocal tie. Okay. What happens though when we're embedded in the network? So it's not just me disclosing to you, it's me disclosing something online. Well, we expect the same pattern to exist, right? So if you post something, I'll often reply. So my brother just last night posted that he was not feeling good. And I got to put a little reply on his Facebook post about how he's not feeling good. That's normal, right? Except that not only can he see that message, it's not private, it's public or semi-public anyway. And so everyone around us can see the message as well. And so you get this kind of cascading set of disclosures in a network this way. So maybe you say something, I say something back, and then it's not you, right? So we're not gonna keep going back and forth in this like perpetual disclosure loop. Actually, someone else might post and feel prompted. And then someone else sees that, and so on and so forth. And we kind of build through the network through this network level reciprocal self-disclosure. You with me? Okay, all right. So we cascade through. So we wondered, is this what happened with Me Too? As you probably already know, the Me Too as a concept and a hashtag existed well before 2017 when it kind of blew up and went mainstream, and most of us heard about it. So Tarana Burke had been working for years under the kind of premise of Me Too as an anti-violence against women slogan and hashtag. And then in 2017, Alyssa Milano, and I think she's being honest about this, like not knowing about Tarana's work, also tweeted this out. This is kind of in the time where we're seeing lots of accusations against like the CEOs of media companies and whatnot. And so to elevate, to elevate attention to this experience of having been harassed, she said, if you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too as a reply to this tweet. The thing about disclosures of sexual assault and harassment is that unfortunately, maybe I think this may be changing a bit, but unfortunately there's still stigmatized experience for the person who experienced the sexual assault and harassment. So we would hope that they're stigmatizing for the perpetrator, but that does not always seem to be the case. But they're certainly still stigmatized. So the argument here is that social media has become really instrumental in allowing people to share stigmatized experiences. And one of the key reasons in the literature kind of before our work was that it's anonymous, right? So you can go online and you can share something bad and stigmatized that has happened to you, and you can do so under the veil of anonymity. But Me Too wasn't anonymous. So Me Too is very much named in a lot of cases. So we saw Me Too used 12 million times on Facebook within 48 hours of this message appearing, right? So we see some cross-platform percolation. And now it's not always the case. Of course, people can have sort of semi-anonymous or pseudonymous Facebook profiles, but Facebook profiles tend to be like you and your name and your friends and family. So to have the sudden outpouring of Me Too under named accounts is pretty unexpected. So suddenly people are talking about this. It was also used 1 million times on Twitter in that same window. So this rapid transformation. So we went from not really talking about sexual assault and harassment to talking about it a whole lot within a couple of days of this tweet landing. In subsequent surveys, we saw 45% of Facebook users said that they saw a friend disclosed, right? So we have a lot of evidence here that there's this non-anonymous disclosure happening kind of all of a sudden. So we were really interested, go back, because that's the method. So we were really interested in like what creates the conditions to allow something like this to transform so quickly. And the way we tried to get at this, we had kind of privileged access to a curated set of tweets for the 2 weeks following this Alyssa Milano tweet. So this included a full set. I can talk in the Q&A about why that's hard to get, but it included every tweet that had the hashtag or the phrase Me Too for those 2 weeks. And we used that set of tweets to first train a model. So we did qualitative content analysis of about 2,500 of those tweets to identify disclosures, or specifically to distinguish Me Too tweets, so that had some kind of disclosure in them versus ones that didn't. And I have in the backup some examples, but the non-disclosure tweets tended to be things like either just generalized support, right? So like, I think it's really brave that all these Me Too people are coming forward with their stories, or things like disgust for perpetrators, that like anybody who's doing this to women, I should be, ashamed of themselves. So that would be an example of non-disclosure. There really wasn't one thing that comes up in the Q&A a lot. It's like, what about like the anti-Me Too people? This was such a tight window of time. Like, I don't think that had really fomented yet. I think that there's a lot more pushback now and like questioning people's legitimacy, but we didn't see a ton of that. But we did this qualitative content analysis to identify disclosures, and then use that to train an automated classifier that could go through the rest of the tweets and label them as disclosures or not disclosures. And then from that, did this quantitative network analysis work to see if there are patterns in the disclosures. And the particular pattern we were looking for is this. And so it would start with a particular person. Now, there's all sorts of imperfections in the data you can get about Twitter, but one thing that we can get is for every person who was in this body of, 500,000 tweets or so, we could see who they were following, right? So we don't know what they actually looked at because we don't know when you logged into Twitter, we don't know how far you scrolled when you logged in and so on, but it's reasonable to expect that they might have seen content from these people. So you look back in time and see who had made a disclosure in their network prior to the time that they themselves had disclosed something. So we have like a little bit of the advantage of history here. And there's going to be some mix, right? So some people will have made Me Too disclosures, some people will not have. And then based on the proportion of disclosures that they could have seen relative to the total number of tweets about Me Too that they saw, we can calculate the likelihood that they themselves will also make a disclosure. That makes sense, right? And so, yeah. And so obviously we can cascade that through the network. And the idea here is that if we're getting this reciprocal self-disclosure effect, then the more times you see disclosures in your own network, the more likely you yourself should be to disclose something. And that is in fact exactly what we see. So the way to read this chart, we have the number of exposures to disclosures, right? It's a little bit of a tongue twister, but the number of messages you couldn't have seen in your network prior to you yourself making disclosures along the bottom. And then we have the probability of you yourself. And we see this really decisive uptick. So the probability that you yourself would make a disclosure goes up, and it goes up particularly dramatically in that window from about 0 to 20. And the thinking here is that not everyone has actually had this experience, right? So we don't have any way to know that information. Like, have you yourself actually been, harassed or assaulted? But if you do hold that experience, you might be more likely to share it as you start to see these disclosures percolate. And then at some point, like, either you haven't had the experience or you decided you're not sharing this information, right? So it makes more sense that the difference between the 5th and 6th disclosure you see would be a bigger difference than between the 51st and the 52nd. Right? So the 52nd is not going to make a difference. If I've seen 50 and I've decided not to disclose, I'm not disclosing. That's not strictly true. We actually do see some variance around even in that 70 plus, but the biggest jump is here up front. Right? So now we have some evidence here that people who are seeing more disclosures in their network are themselves more likely to disclose, which of course then will propagate that across the network, because when I make a disclosure about sexual assault or harassment, I'm not only disclosing to the people whose disclosures I already saw, I am posting it for my whole network to see. So you'd expect this effect to be mutually reinforcing with some, time decay. We do see that kind of decisive shift. So here at that big jump up, this is just the like overall rank of that a particular hashtag. This is a great little tool called story wrangling. I'm not sure if it's broken now with the API, but we can go check it out. So what they do is they track all the words and phrases on Twitter in order of the most popular to the least popular. Do you want to guess what the most popular word on Twitter is?
Trump.
It's up there. That's like number 5, and it varies. No, it's a BTS, like a K-pop. So I thought that was funny. Actually, they had to like exclude it. So there are some stop words that you put when you're doing language modeling, and you'll exclude like the and of. And in order to get big language models to work on Twitter, you have to exclude BTS because it's so common. Sometimes you also have to exclude Trump. But yeah, you can go on and on about that. But we do see so those things accepting, we do see. So during the window where this study was focusing, we saw Me Too jump up to about the 100th most popular word or phrase on Twitter. So there was this decisive shift from like not really talking about it a whole lot to talking about it a whole lot. And we see some kind of gradual decline over the next couple of years, but really, I mean, we're talking about a phase transition here for any physicists or physicists want to be is in the room, that we really see this decisive shift. And so, I don't have a counterfactual world where we didn't have this mutual self-disclosure, but there's some evidence here that once we started talking about it, we like cascaded and then kind of stuck, that we keep talking about it. All right, so I want to leave plenty of time for the Q&A, and I think we're getting about there. So, I have 3 takeaways for you, plus 1. I'm not so confident in the last takeaway, but we'll talk about it. Okay. Hashtag activism can be this effective tool, especially for marginalized or stigmatized communities, to create social change. When we first started doing this work, we had to argue, like, does online communication even matter? I think, for many reasons, we were all agreeing that online communication matters, but I think it still matters, especially for these marginalized and stigmatized groups. During the kind of Elon Musk debacle at Twitter, I got a bunch of press inquiries, and the one thing I did share about that is I think, I just, like, my heart breaks for, I don't know of another platform that has these kinds of affordances of both permeability between communities, or discoverability, and amplification. There are lots of platforms where we can discover communities, and there are lots of platforms where we can amplify things beyond the kind of borders of our own following. But there are not other places where you can do both. And my heart really breaks from the loss of capacity here. I think it's really easy to say this stuff doesn't matter, but if it's the only tool you have in order to change the narrative about something in mainstream, yes, like, of course, vote, of course, lobby your members of Congress, of course, and try to get the media to cover your stories, but not everyone can do that. Not everyone's legally allowed to do those things. Not everyone finds those things safe. Not everyone knows how to navigate those systems. And so Twitter provided this alternate tool, and I hope something will come in its vacuum, but it matters, and it mattered, especially in these cases for folks who didn't have other ways to tell their stories. It works through these complex networked processes. I think because of the work that I've done, I often get papers to review that try to disentangle these things. So it's like either a systems paper about the network systems, or it's an individual's paper about, like, individual content. And folks try to argue real hard for one way or another. And, not everyone can do all the work, right? So there's lots of us for a reason, and all of us should be contributing. But I think it's foolish to try to separate them out. So, like, it's both, why not both? Like, as the internet kids like to say. So it's both, right? So it's individual choices and individual stories, and it's the aggregation through these networks that allow you and I to see this stuff that otherwise we might not see. And then hashtag activism influences the mainstream media and collective conversations. That at the end of the day, like, that's still the golden ticket. That getting covered by the mainstream media is what allows the social change, the kind of downstream social change, to happen. Right? We need the ideas to be out there, and then the policies to be enacted. That's where you all come in. And then this is the one I'm not sure about. So I up until, like, a couple of months ago, always said, keep tweeting, like, being there and engaging matters. I think maybe I would broaden this out to say, like, keep active in whatever online space you are currently monitoring for social change. I don't know what that is right now. We were just talking this morning. Is it LinkedIn? Like, maybe, Facebook, sort of. So wherever you are, like, keep engaging, and maybe the call is to find and invest and let me know about alternate places where people can engage with ideas that aren't already percolating in their sort of periphery, right? So places where you see things that your immediate friends maybe aren't experiencing, and where you can share that out with others and not only your immediate followers. So I think that's the call to action. Those of you who might find yourself in media companies in the future, this is a tremendous potential. And these small acts of engaging with content can have, when aggregated, this transformative potential. And I don't want to lose that. I think it's a really important function of the society. I'd like to imagine that we could go back to a time where folks kind of gather in community centers, but that's not going to happen, right? And arguably it never really happened to begin with. And so let's not lose sight of that as a way to create change about the issues we care about. So that's the book. You can download it for free. If you have a physical copy, I'm happy to sign it, but don't spend money on it if you don't have to. And then, of course, we don't do work in a vacuum. So here's all my collaborators and the papers that I talked about today. That's it. I'm happy to take Q&A.